The sky above the imperial spaceport was overcast, as if reflecting the state of the empire itself. An empire slowly crumbling, caught between its former glory and its grim reality. Esten, the man known as the Sage of the Black Dawn, walked with steady steps through the large hangar where small ships were neatly docked. Each ship bore the crest of a noble family that had come to beg the emperor for one favor or another. In the far corner, Esten noticed a group of simple silver ships, each marked with a different symbol. One bore a paw print, another a ghostly figure, a third a red thread, a fourth a skull, and finally one marked with an owl. Esten stopped at the ship with the owl emblem and quickly placed his foot on the ladder, climbing up swiftly and making his way to the seat beyond the simple bunk. As the ladder retracted into the ship and the hatch closed, he let his mind reach out and touch the ship as it hummed to life. A strange sensation washed over him, and he suddenly recognized parts of the ship that had previously been an illusion to him. He almost laughed as he realized that even this small envoy vessel was equipped with an FTL drive. "We lost so much more than we ever knew," he whispered as the ship lifted softly off the floor. Red lights and a blaring siren filled the hangar, warning everyone to exit quickly or remain in their ships. Esten waited calmly for the all-clear before sliding the ship forward through the slight gap in the bay doors and making his way down to Vatica. It wasn't long before the ship broke through the atmosphere, descending rapidly toward a landing pad. The ship taxied along the runway before finally setting down on a stone surface laid in an intricate pattern. Gold-colored bricks formed the crossed keys of the Emperor's seal, surrounded by red stone. Esten rose from his chair as he saw slaves, like he had once been, scurrying over to the ship, only to be shooed away by an old cardinal in a red robe. The cardinal's white sash, bearing the insignia of the College of Relics, hung around his shoulders as he waved his crozier in the air, dispersing the slaves. Esten made his way down the ladder and let the cool morning air of Vatica fill his lungs. "Ah, my lord sage, what brings you to us today? Have you come to partake in the festival?" the old cardinal asked, a forced smile painted on his face. "Forgive me, Cardinal," Esten said slowly and deliberately. "I did not mean to drop in unannounced on a day to honor the gods. I've been on a mission, and one tends to lose track of time when sailing the Black Sea for 6 years. What day is today?" "Oh, it's quite all right, my lord. Today is the 1st of October, and we," the old cardinal began, but Esten held up a hand to cut him off, "are preparing the festival of creation to honor the brothers Scallon and Huang, the gods of uninhibited creation. All around the city, people will let their passions flow and create without shame or question, letting music, poetry, dance, and all other forms of art flow freely." Esten finished the explanation, showing off his knowledge. "Ah, yes, I suppose I should have simply said the date. You are, after all, the most devout servant of the emperor," the old cardinal said with a bow, his tone almost mocking. "I'm afraid I didn't come to worship today," Esten said, ignoring the cardinal's jab. "Rather, I must see the House of Medici, but it seems I could not have picked a more auspicious day. Tell me, is Lord Tomes still the head of the house?" The old cardinal smiled as he straightened himself, his teeth showing clearly in their dilapidated state. "Yes, my lord, he is. He was quite opposed to the emperor's recent decision to tax even the church to support the war effort. I know it's not my place, but I must admit it's a decision I don't have the perspective to understand." Esten smiled a calm, relaxed smile. "It is not our duty to understand, but may Lord Chomsky bless you in your prayers with greater understanding," he said as he took the cardinal's hands in his. "Such a wonderful blessing, child," a voice to his left spoke. A voice he knew all too well. He had heard it in devoted prayer, had heard it when he performed a duty incorrectly, and he still remembered how that voice had praised him when he survived the trial of relics. "Pope Grazia," Esten said with a smile as he turned to see the old priest who had practically raised him. The Pope was dressed in a heavy robe of black and silver, a great high hat of red and black perched on his head. His fingers bore rings with the various symbols of the different colleges of the church. The man met Esten's smile and light bow, and both straightened up. The old man pulled him into a hug, whispering in his ear, "Well, let's keep this little bit of heresy between us, son," drawing a slight laugh from Esten. He broke the hug and stepped back. As I understand it, you've come to see my brother. Let me escort you to his estate. It's not far, and those preparing for the festival will have their spirits lifted as we walk among them. Esten smiled and nodded, and the two began to walk down the cobblestone path to exit the courtyard of the temple. All around, on cobblestone streets and surrounding stone-cut buildings, stages of simple wood were being set up. Instruments of every kind, easels, and dance floors were being arranged, with dozens of people attending to every little detail. I always loved this holiday, Pope Gratius said with a soft smile. I had a slave once who went on to better things and would create the most beautiful things on this day. I wonder if his journeys have led him to any new understandings of the gods. Esten stifled a laugh. It was so odd that even now, as the man who had raised him had reached the highest position in the church, they had to pretend as if his childhood simply hadn't happened, or had belonged to a different person. Well, Your Holiness, I would think as he matured and came to understand the world more, he would realize that the glory isn't simply in the creation but in the preservation. The Pope raised an eyebrow as he spoke, stepping carefully on the cobblestones and letting artists who approached kiss his ring. Would you share your insight? It isn't often the sage is available to speak with me on the scriptures. The brothers Scallon and Huang were men once. Men who made a tradition to come together one day a year to create without shame or inhibition, to simply let creation wash over them and set them free. And while that wholeness, that presence, is admirable and holy in itself, what allowed them to enter the realm of the gods was the preservation of those days. Were it not for that, the beauty of their creations would have been lost. Esten spoke softly as they walked, his words falling on the ears of the Pope and the crowd that had gathered and followed in their footsteps, as they made their way past stained glass windows casting images on the ground in the morning sun. Yes, even the beauty of this light fades if one does not capture it, the old man said, gesturing to the colored light. But what of their alliance? Esten paused for a moment. He could rattle off some details, but he was wise enough to know when someone had a point to make. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Your Holiness. Well, each man was an accomplished musician in his own right before they ascended to godhood, with many creations and relics saved among them. But it wasn't until they chose to create together, to make something bigger than themselves, that they were able to step into the domain of the gods. For no man gets to the heavens on their own. He paused as he stepped close to the gate. Even we, the sage, my duty on this earth is to guide men to the will of the gods. Certainly, they may ascend to the white halls of Washington without my help, but I cannot get there without them, just as Lady Nightingale won't collect those who battle only themselves. They approached the gates of the Medici estate as the Pope spoke. The wrought iron gates, with intricate patterns of roses, swung wide as they reached them. Well, I believe I've mused on the hearts of the gods long enough for the moment. And it seems my brother is expecting you, sage. The two men smiled and bowed slightly as they parted ways, the Pope making his way back into the gathered crowd to continue his impromptu sermon, and Esten walking up the brick-patterned path to the grand doors of the estate. He stopped at the large dark wood doors, raising his hand, only for them to swing wide before he touched them. Lord Thomas Medici awaits the Sage of the Black Dawn, Hand of the Emperor, in the conservatory. A servant in a simple suit spoke clearly and with pride. Wrapped around his eyes were white bandages, a signal that he had been blinded to preserve the dignity of his master as he served him. Tom's health must have deteriorated while I was on mission, Esten thought, making his way into the manor and following the servant through the halls to a room of glass. The morning sun broke through the trees, and the scent of flowers hung heavy in the air. In the center of the glass-walled conservatory, surrounded by lush greenery and vibrant flowers, sat Lord Thomas Medici. The once powerful lord was now confined to a wheeled chair of steel and wood, his nearly 80 winters weighing heavily on his frail frame. His ornate gray and silver doublet, embroidered with purple stitching, hung loosely on his thin body. Despite his physical decline, his presence still carried an air of authority, and his sharp eyes bore into Esten as he entered the room. "Have you come to convince me to support the Emperor's tax?" The old man choked out, his voice soft but stern, like the gentle cascade of the tide along a cliff's face. "No, sir," Esten replied softly and kindly. I had simply heard your gardens are lovely this time of year, and thought we might enjoy Mendel's bounty together today. The old man scoffed, wheeling around in his chair to face Esten and glare at him. Even bound to the chair, his gaze was piercing. Bullshit, he spat. Oh, come now, Papa. Don't be like that. A woman's voice came from the side of the room as Lady Medici walked up. She was in her 30s, with short-cut red hair and a dress of gray and purple embroidery, with long, flowy sleeves. The sage came all this way simply to enjoy the garden with you. He's been on a ship for the last 6 years on a mission for the Empire, and Mother's garden is famous across the worlds. The least you could do is walk with him. She smiled sweetly at both men. And perhaps he'll even tolerate a discourse on the taxes if the flowers are in bloom, she added with a wink at Esten. Lady Medici, Esten said, taking her offered hand and kissing it softly. You seem to possess not only your mother's beauty, but her wisdom. I was sorry to hear of her passing. Yes, it was a difficult time for us, she said with a soft sigh and a smile. Father hasn't quite been himself since. Don't talk about me like I'm not here, the man growled. Fine, we'll walk the garden. But don't think for a second I won't bring up these fool taxes. He spun his chair and waited. Well, you wanted to walk, he said with disdain. Esten stepped behind him and pushed the chair out into the garden, its wheels rolling smoothly along the paved path as the trees cast a beautiful shade overhead. Vines climbed up their trunks, with flowers blooming in vibrant yellows and reds. So, Sage, I take it the mission was successful? The woman asked as she stepped in place beside them, keeping pace with their slow, deliberate walk. I must admit, we didn't expect you back for some time still. It was, Esten replied, purposely light on the details. We captured a ship as intended. Smaller ships are faster, it turns out, so I made it back well before the rest of the regiment. The old man grunted, committing an entire regiment just to add one ship to the fleet. The thing's probably barely even seaworthy. He spat on the floor to punctuate his disdain. It actually is a surprisingly well-preserved relic, similar to our destroyer-class ships, Esten mused, trying to hide the true nature of the ship. Ah, so we recovered something they had stolen from humanity. No way those mindless brutes could have made it. That's good, then, the old man said. Esten did his best to hide his wincing at the words. The old man's attitude was one he himself had held less than a fortnight before, and he was deeply ashamed it had ever been the case. Papa has been concerned since the Emperor's changes to the tax structure. Lady Medici cut in to change the subject. Esten must not have done a decent enough job hiding his feelings. He wondered why the shame didn't seem clouded in fog but brushed the thought aside to try to focus. He worries perhaps we are stretching too thin. It's a reasonable concern to hold, Lady Medici, Esten responded. She quickly cut him off, laying a hand softly on his arm. Please, Lord Sage, call me Eleanor, she said with a smile, keeping her hand resting on his arm. Well, Eleanor, he began, a smile crossing his face before a heavy sigh. It's a difficult calculus. The equation requires we consider the cost of arming and training each Marine, the movement of our ships, the inevitable losses, and on the other side of it, what we gain, each planet that we take and secure and what it can produce. You speak true, boy, but it seems we're forcing more coin into the Marines for less return. The Lord spoke as Esten pushed his chair to a stop in front of a fountain. I worry you may be correct, sir, Esten said, his voice lowering. In fact, the equation isn't rightly structured at all. We've lost 2 full regiments in the last year alone. In the 6 years the Black Dawn was committed to capturing a single ship, nearly 80 million Marines found honorable graves on contested planets. Each one so ravaged by our claim to it that it'll take generations to even support itself. I fear it was never considered just how long repairing the damage an orbital bombardment does to the soil would take. He sighed as they took in the flowing of the fountain, the drops of water loud enough to cover the soft tones of his voice should anyone be listening from a distance. I worry the scales aren't balanced, not simply because we have placed too much weight on the effort to claim new lands, but because we never considered the value of the lands themselves. He spoke in hushed tones, making it clear that his words were meant to be kept among those around him. You surprise me, lad. Lord Medici spoke calmly, in the same hushed tones. I suppose you take your duty to protect the empire even from itself more seriously than that large fool you keep. Esten laughed. Bear's quite a good marine, but his purpose is far different than mine. He came here just before the taxes, talking about the glory of the empire and asking for our support. Eleanor spoke calmly and quietly. And while we support the empire in all things, we still have the freedom to speak our minds. And our minds were not made up. Well, perhaps a different approach, Esten said calmly, wondering how easy this process really had been. How quickly he seemed to pull on the strings to garner their support. Perhaps it's time we began to hone our blades rather than strike with them. An interesting thought, lad, the old man said, stroking his freshly shaved chin. Perhaps you would escort my daughter to the festival. I'm afraid I have far too much to think on to honor the gods today. That would be quite lovely, Lady Medici said with a smile. I was already dressed to attend with Papa. It's my favorite festival of the year. We will speak again another time, sir, Esten said with a nod as the woman linked her arm with him and led him back out of the gardens and manor. Walking slowly through the city as the stages had been filled with random citizens playing music, they improvised at the moment to the cheers and dances of the crowds. My lord, I must say, Eleanor began, a concerned smile on her face. It seems you carry a greater weight than you admit. Esten smiled softly at the woman, wondering just how much he had let slip in subtext. You're quite an insightful woman, my lady. I thought I was hiding it better, he said with a laugh. Oh, you're hiding it just fine, she responded, covering her mouth as she giggled softly. But I've spent my life surrounded by the imperial court and the full diocese. I'm perhaps more accurate with insight than you are with those pistols. And I remember watching you shatter a marine's helmet with a single shot when I was only 10. Esten laughed at the comparison, a pure, joyful laugh. Well, Lady Medici, it seems your family's house is in wonderful hands. Oh, enough of that, she said, swatting his arm playfully. It's the 1st of October, and it's usually best to give those feelings up to the gods. What better day and way to do it than here? She asked with a smile, guiding him to a stage near the center of the city square. It was somewhat surprising to Esten that none had stepped on it yet, but he supposed it was still early in the festival, and many had not worked up the courage to do so yet, or had enough liquid courage. She pulled him roughly up the stairs, gesturing for him to choose an instrument. He moved swiftly, lifting a 21-string harp guitar off a stand and resting it on his knee as he took a seat. He glanced up at the woman for a moment and saw her smiling down sweetly and encouragingly. He began to pluck at the strings, the 6 low bass strings and 9 high trebles ringing out purely as he fretted a mournful melody on the 6 strings that hovered over the instrument's neck. He heard the mournful cry of a cello and glanced over to see Lady Medici sitting in a chair across from him, matching the melody he plucked in the lower register. He let the sounds wash over him, let the song continue for a few bars before he began to sing. I swore I'd never grow old, the weight of time unknown. It seeped down in my bones, the weight of dreams untold. He let the words ring out with the melody, waiting as the notes finished before singing them again. After the second time, he heard Eleanor's voice join him, her higher register laying in perfect harmony to his own as they repeated the words. Over and over they sang them, until they let themselves grow quiet, the song fading from their lips, the sounds of the instruments fading from the air. He hadn't even opened his eyes before he heard the applause, snapping them open to see the gathered crowd who had taken the time to share in the moment of existential mourning as they considered the weight of all the world and every duty. He stood, linking hands with Eleanor, and bowed before moving off the stage. Well, that was wonderful, she said, almost breathless. Papa never lets me participate in the festival. He'll be quite cross with you, she said with a slight wink, placing a quick, mischievous kiss on his cheek and pulling him away. They came to a stop at a stall as she held up 2 fingers, then pulled his right hand up to show the brand of the crossed keys on his palm. I'm sure the Emperor won't mind treating a lady to a drink, she said with a smile and a wink as the man behind the stand handed over 2 heavy horn tankards laden with mead. Esten could smell the honey and notes of nuts and fresh fall fruit. He drank deeply, draining his in one long gulp, before handing it back to the man who had already prepared another for him. "I suppose songs do make one thirsty," the woman said with a smile, taking a sip of her own mead before linking her arm with Esten and pulling him deeper into the festival. They walked for a time, arm in arm, taking in the sights and sounds of people exploring creativity. As they walked through the festival, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Eleanor turned to Esten with a curious expression. "Sage, may I ask you a question?" she said, not waiting for his response before barreling forward. "You've seen things out in the Black Sea. Unimaginable horrors, beautiful things we would never have even guessed at. But what if you learned things were different than you imagined?" Esten paused, wondering what she might be getting at. "I'm not certain I understand what you're asking." "Well, take Arachna, for instance," she continued, her voice lowering slightly. "You ignited the planet's entire surface to protect the Empire. But what if you came to learn the spiders on it had a culture, worshipped like we do, made music, sang songs? Hells, what if they could read?" Esten stiffened instantly. Did she know? Was she a telepath? Those were conscripted into the Imperial service whenever they were found and were incredibly rare to begin with. Most could barely make sense of a man's thoughts, much less draw out what they were trying to hide. "Ah, I suppose that's a terrifying idea to think of," Eleanor said with a soft, joyful laugh, breaking the tension. "Could you imagine? Giant spiders who can read? I can't decide if that's an idea for a comedy or a horror play. Though either way, I would watch it." Esten forced a smile, though his mind raced. He had seen things in the Black Sea, things that had shaken his understanding of the universe. The Empire's narrative of humanity's supremacy was beginning to crack under the weight of what he had witnessed. But he couldn't share that, not here, not now. "Perhaps it would make for an interesting play," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "But let's not dwell on such dark thoughts today. This is a day for creation, not contemplation." Eleanor nodded, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, as if she could sense the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. She linked her arm with his again, and they continued to walk through the festival, the sounds of music and laughter surrounding them. As the day wore on, Esten found himself reflecting on his past. Specifically, the trial of relics that had marked his transformation from a lowly slave to the sage of the Black Dawn. The memories were vivid, almost too vivid, as if the relics in his blood had etched them permanently into his mind. He remembered the cold steel table, the restraints on his wrists and ankles, and the old priest's gravelly voice. 7 of every 10 boys, the priest had said. That's how many the relics kill rather than let carry them. The gray, shimmery liquid had burned like fire as it entered his veins, and he had screamed, thrashing against the restraints as his body convulsed. The pain had been unbearable, but worse than the pain was the fear that he would die, that the relics would consume him, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell. But he had survived. For 28 days, 21 hours, 14 minutes, and 7 seconds, he had endured the agony, his body and mind reshaped by the ancient relics. When he had finally emerged, he was no longer the same person. He was stronger, faster, and imbued with knowledge he couldn't explain. The relics had chosen him, and he had become a vestige of the ancients. Esten's thoughts turned to the Black Dawn, the elite regiment he now served. They were the Empire's most feared warriors, clad in relic armor and tasked with the most dangerous missions. But even among them, Esten was unique. The relics in his blood gave him abilities that set him apart, abilities that made him both revered and feared. He remembered his first mission with the Black Dawn, a raid on a pirate stronghold hidden in the asteroid belt. The pirates had been well armed and well prepared, but Esten had moved through their ranks like a shadow, his movements precise and deadly. The relics had guided him, showing him weaknesses in the enemy's defenses and predicting their movements before they even made them. But even as he fought, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The pirates had been desperate, their eyes filled with a fear that went beyond the fear of death. They had been fighting for something more than survival, something they believed in. And as Esten cut them down, he couldn't help but wonder if he was on the right side. As the sun began to set, the festival reached its crescendo. The streets were filled with revelers, their faces lit by the warm glow of lanterns and the cold light of the moons above. Esten and Eleanor found themselves at the edge of the city, looking out over the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her voice soft. "For all its flaws, the Empire has created something worth preserving." Esten nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He had seen the beauty of the Empire, but he had also seen its darkness. The relics in his blood whispered to him, their voices a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for this beauty. "Yes," he said finally, "it is beautiful, but beauty is fragile, and it must be protected." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "You carry a heavy burden, Sage. But you don't have to carry it alone." Esten smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps one day, I'll believe that." As the first stars appeared in the sky, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of the Empire and the secrets it held hanging between them. The following morning, Esten found himself once again at the gates of the Medici estate. The festival had ended, but the city was still alive with the echoes of celebration. The streets were quieter now, the revelers replaced by merchants setting up their stalls for the day. Esten was greeted by the same blind servant who had escorted him the day before. "Lord Tomes awaits you in the study," the servant said, his voice calm and respectful. Esten followed him through the grand halls of the manor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Lord Tomes was seated in a high-backed chair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. His daughter, Eleanor, stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The old man's eyes were sharp, though, and they fixed on Esten as he entered the room. "You've come to talk about the taxes again," Lord Tomes said, his voice a low growl. "Or perhaps you've come to ask for something more." Esten shook his head. "No, my lord. I've come to speak of something far more important." Lord Tomes raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be?" "The future of the Empire," Esten replied. "And the role your house will play in it." Esten took a seat across from Lord Tomes, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. He had spent the night considering his next move, and now it was time to act. "The Empire is dying," Esten said bluntly. "The war has drained our resources, and the people are growing restless. The Emperor's decisions, like the tax on the church, are only hastening our decline." Lord Tomes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what would you have me do about it? I am but one man, and my house is but one of many." "You are more than that," Esten said. "Your house has influence, connections, and resources. You could be the catalyst for change." Lord Tomes scoffed. "Change? What kind of change? A rebellion? A coup? Do you think I would risk everything for some idealistic vision of the future?" Esten shook his head. "Not a rebellion. A reformation. The Empire needs to adapt, to evolve. We cannot continue down this path of endless war and exploitation. We need to find a new way forward." Lord Tomes leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And what role would you have me play in this reformation?" Esten smiled. "You would be the voice of reason, the one who brings the other noble houses together. You would be the one who convinces them that change is necessary, and that it can be done without tearing the Empire apart." Over the next few days, Esten worked tirelessly to build support for his plan. He met with representatives from the other noble houses, using his position as the Sage of the Black Dawn to gain their trust. He spoke of the need for unity, for a new vision of the Empire that could sustain itself without constant war. But not everyone was convinced. There were those who saw Esten's ideas as a threat to their power, and they began to plot against him. Rumors spread through the city, whispers of treason and conspiracy. The Emperor's spies were everywhere, and Esten knew it was only a matter of time before they caught wind of his plans. The tension came to a head one evening, as Esten was preparing to leave the Medici estate. He was met at the gates by a group of imperial guards, their weapons drawn. "Esten, Sage of the Black Dawn," their leader said, his voice cold. "You are under arrest for treason against the Empire." Esten's hand went to the hilt of his pistol, but he knew it was too late. The guards outnumbered him, and even with the relics in his blood, he couldn't fight them all. But before the guards could move, a voice rang out from behind them. "Stand down!" It was Eleanor, her face flushed with anger. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "This man is under the protection of House Medici. You will not touch him." The guards hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. They knew the power of House Medici, and they knew better than to cross its members. Eleanor turned to Esten, her expression softening. "Go," she said. "Finish what you started." Esten nodded, his heart heavy with gratitude. He turned and disappeared into the night, the guards watching helplessly as he slipped away. In the weeks that followed, Esten's plan began to take shape. The noble houses, led by Lord Tomes, came together to demand reforms from the emperor. The people, inspired by the promise of a better future, rallied behind them. The emperor, faced with the threat of rebellion, had no choice but to listen. He agreed to the reforms, though it was clear he did so reluctantly. The empire began to change, slowly but surely, as the old ways gave way to the new. Esten watched it all from the shadows, his role in the events known only to a few. He had done what he set out to do, but he knew the fight was far from over. The empire was still fragile, and there were those who would seek to undo the progress that had been made. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. He stood on the balcony of the Medici estate, looking out over the city as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The empire was still standing, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope for the future. Esten knew that his journey was far from over. The relics in his blood whispered to him, their voices a constant reminder of the power and responsibility he carried. He had saved the empire, but at a cost. The weight of his actions, the lives he had taken, and the secrets he had uncovered would stay with him forever. But he also knew that he had done what was necessary. The empire would endure, and perhaps one day it would thrive. And when that day came, Esten would be ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of rest. The dawn had come, and with it, the promise of a new beginning.